So this is the masthead of William Lloyd Garrison's original abolitionist newspaper, but it's colorized because it's the Liberator dot today. So excuse the mess, we're moving, and excuse the poor lighting. It looks like we're in for a thunderstorm, praise God. My name is Lowell Bliss, and this is episode 27 of the Liberator Today's video series on hope. This puts us halfway in our study, and we've learned enough about hope that it's time to go out to the deep end. I'm not talking about the deep end of a municipal swimming pool. We need to learn how to swim in the deep end of the Atlantic Ocean. Or there is this, a recent study by the World Economic Forum has projected that by 2050 there will be more plastic by weight in the ocean than fish and other sea life by weight. We need to prepare to swim in that type of dreadful waters. So let me alert you to 3 changes in our year-long series. First, we're going to finally dive into 3 classic texts on hope. Jonathan Lear's book, Radical Hope, Ethics in the Face of Cultural Devastation, is one book. It's primarily a study of the last great chief of the Crow people. Jacques Allou's book, Hope in Time of Abandonment. It will be so relentless it will almost be more than we can handle. And then finally there's Walter Brueggemann's The Prophetic Imagination. It'll feel like the only framework we will ever need. Secondly, I'm also changing the primary focus of our application. I want to speak more as a Christian climate activist, believing that climate change will be the biggest driver of suffering, conflict, and oppression in our lifetimes. What does hope in a time of global climate change look like? And thirdly, we're going to look at the type of hope that survives and thrives in the midst of abject hopelessness, when all optimism has burned off, when denial and despair are our greatest enemies, when the harsh reality is both more real than we could have imagined and more harsh than we ever expected. This is often called radical hope. For instance, the last great chief of the Crow people was a remarkable man named Plenty Coups. Author Jonathan Lear uses the phrase cultural devastation to refer to what the Crow tribe of Plenty Coups' day faced. The bison would be all gone. What would it mean for a Crow man to be a Crow man or a Crow woman? All of that would be lost. Their freedom of movement over their own home and their sacred lands would be limited. The antagonistic other, in this case the white man, would take over completely. They had no precedents for imagining what a future life could look like. But the Creator God gave them hope through the wisdom he gave to Plenty Coups. Climate change headlines are a consistent backdrop now in the news, so consistent that they don't register anymore, it seems, as we pay attention instead to the World Cup, the Thai cave rescue, the immigrant children, or the new Supreme Court pick. But just off the top of my head, here are some of the recent developments. Scientists believe that Antarctica is melting 3 times faster than expected. The planet may experience its first ever Category 6 hurricane. Flooding in Japan kills upwards to 100 people. Record high temperatures were set around the globe, including in California. One record was particularly strange, the hottest low temperature ever recorded. On June 26 in the city of Kiryat Oman, the temperature, the minimum, never dropped below 108.7 degrees, 42.6 Celsius. Also recently in the news, journalist Elizabeth Arnold published a story entitled, "Dear Media, we need more stories about resilience to climate change. Less doom and gloom." She writes, quote, "This familiar narrative about communities facing sea level rise and coastal erosion fits into a larger pattern of climate change coverage. The threats posed to humans, polar bears, and entire ecosystems are recounted on a daily basis, leading to what researchers call a hope gap. With little offered in the way of action or response, people eventually tune out. We're doomed, they say. What's on Hulu? don't know for sure, but I suspect Arnold is using the phrase hope gap in a sociological sense, not in a faith or a religious sense. She thinks that more stories about action, response, and resilience can close that gap. And yes, perhaps that gap can be closed, but how far really? If we push it closed as far as it can go and there's more gap left, an abyss in fact, because we've already used up all our psychological resources in closing it this far, then what do we have left here? I would argue that this is a radical hope gap. In July 2012, climate activist Bill McKibben published a seminal article entitled "The Reckoning: Global Warming's Terrifying New Math." McKibben's new math is based on 3 specific numbers. Here they are. 2, as in 2 degrees Celsius, a believed achievable maximum of global average warming beyond which climate impacts are deemed intolerable. 2 degrees is the target of the Paris Agreement. Another number, 565, as in 565 gigatons, the total amount of additional carbon dioxide which the world can emit, beyond which forcings will exceed a 2 degrees Celsius increase. You can think of it as a carbon budget. We can spin this and no more. Finally, last number, 2,795, as in 2,795 gigatons. The amount of emittable carbon dioxide in the known fossil fuel reserves of companies and countries. Quote, in short, it's the fossil fuel we're currently planning on burning. And the key point is that this new number, 2,795, is higher than 565, 5 times higher. In the end, McKibben isn't ultimately intent on doing math any more than he is intent on doing science. He's telling a story, as befitting his expertise as a journalist. A story that fits in the cavernous discrepancy between 565 gigatons and 2,795. That's how the story ends, McKibben writes, added. We have 5 times as much oil and coal and gas on the books as climate scientists think is safe to burn. We'd have to keep 80% of these reserves locked away underground to avoid that fate. Before we knew those numbers, our fate had been likely. Now, barring some massive intervention, it seems certain, unquote. If all known reserves worldwide are valued, as per J.P. Morgan and the Capital Institute, at U.S. $27 trillion, then 80% represents $20 trillion in assets that McKibben would have us wipe off the books. $20 trillion represents assets which countries like Kuwait or Venezuela, have already declared. This wealth has been figured into share prices. It's already been borrowed against. Who's to say that the resulting global economic calamity won't be as disastrous as a climate one, as unjust in its outcomes, as unloving for the poor? In my opinion, $20 trillion is one of the strongest numbers to indicate the inevitable failure of climate change mitigation. McKibben argues that obsolete industries strand assets all the time, but fossil fuel reserves are not just potentially stranded assets. They are supply chains on which virtually every other business in the world is dependent. In my opinion, there is no way that 80% of known reserves will be kept in the ground. I am purposefully leading us to the edge of the abyss to see if God, good and free and sovereign, is waiting for us there, ready to greet us with radical hope. Next week, I'll argue that while our greatest and best leaders are offering us hope, they are not providing the radical hope that we desperately need as we encounter more and more tipping points on the road to devastation. I'm Lowell Bliss, Christian environmental missionary and climate activist. Thank you for visiting the Liberator today.